I'm Andrea Isabel Lucas, founder of Bar and Soul and author of Own It All. The Own It All podcast is all about how to stop waiting for change and start creating it because your life belongs to you. Every week, I interview inspiring women and they share their tips about how to own it all in the various areas of your life, like career, time management, health, style, and relationships. Tune in every week so they can share their advice with you. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review in your favorite listening app. Hi, and welcome to the Own It All podcast. Today, I am so excited. My guest is Emilie Aries. Emilie and I met a couple of years ago. I think it was fate that intervened when she was looking for a space to hold a yoga class for a workshop she was doing one weekend. And it was just like such an instant match. I'm so excited that we met Emilie. And Emilie also wrote me up in Forbes a couple of years ago. So it's just been so exciting that our paths crossed. And I'm so excited to have you here today, Emilie.
I love it, Andrea. Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to tell you guys a little bit about Emilie because her bio is just like so multifaceted and so interesting. So Emilie's a speaker, a podcast host, very soon to be first-time author. Her book is coming out in just a couple months. She's the founder and CEO of Bossed Up, which is an award-winning training company where she helps women craft happy, healthy, and sustainable career paths. She has a TED Talk. It's called The Power of No. And in that TED Talk, she shares how to set healthy boundaries and how to invest in your sustainable success. Her forthcoming book, Bossed Up, A Grown Woman's Guide to Getting Your Shit Together, will be released by Public Affair Books. I believe that's coming out in May.
Yep, May 21st. Yep.
Okay, great. And that's going to serve as a practical, tactical roadmap for women who want to write their own come-up story on their own terms. And she's also hosts a twice-a-week podcast, Bossed Up Podcast, where Emilie and her expert guests break down listener career conundrums and offer boss tips to help you beat burnout and craft a sustainable career path. So big themes that I'm hearing are career, burnout / sustainability. Those seem like two really powerful themes in your work.
Definitely. And I want to first thank you for joining me on the Bossed Up podcast not too long ago to share some of your incredible story with our listeners. So it's fun to be back here jamming with you on your podcast. So hello to the Own It All community.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like there's so much synergy between both of our work and our messages. So yeah, It really was very cool that you just happened to be looking for a yoga studio one weekend and we bumped into each other. That was great.
I felt like we were jiving right away. So you're definitely a sister in the whole quest for, feminist, bringing a bit of feminism to every part of our lives. I think it's a perfect way to look at owning your power in a world that doesn't always want women to.
Absolutely. And I also find it really interesting that your background actually started in politics.
Yep. Definitely. So I graduated at the height of the Great Recession in 2009. And even though it was very hard to find a job, and at first I had considered myself very fortunate to land a paid internship in Washington, D.C., I had studied political science and cognitive science because I've always been fascinated by the interplay between how we make collective decisions as a society and how we make our own choices individually in our own minds. So after stumbling my way through an internship that wasn't a great fit, to be honest, I networked my way to a really incredible opportunity to step up as the youngest state director in the nation, serving on behalf of then newly elected President Barack Obama, and spend the next 5 years or so organizing, growing our power, making sure people's voices were heard in Washington, and then leveraging online technology for campaigns. And so at 26, I was a senior digital political strategist, kind of killing it, to be honest, which was great. But I also derived a lot from the realm of politics about helping me own my own power and helping, and basically it inspired me to want to help other women own their power over their careers, which began my transition essentially out of campaigns and elections into starting my own business in 2013.
That's so interesting. So what did politics teach you about owning your career?
It's funny because I love politics to this day, even though it's a very not only male dominated, but very aggressive field in a lot of ways. I feel like, we've been in better places than we are currently in the state of politics. But what politics taught me is that power is something you can create. It is this there are mediums through which you can grow your own power, and you can grow your power through collective organizing. So I've always been an organizer, but I never really realized that the same way that we grow our constituencies and collective community around lobbying for change on the political level, you can basically grow your power and run your own campaign to land your dream job, which is funny because I actually remember interviewing with the Democratic National Committee, and the first thing my interviewer said when she picked up the phone for our phone interview was, "Okay, Emily, you can call the campaign off," because I had already lined up like 20 people who I knew were much more senior to me and were colleagues that this woman who was interviewing me would respect. And I said, "Hey, here's her email, here's her phone number. Could you put in a good word for me? I have an interview coming up." So I'd already been organizing on my own behalf. And what I realized is that you can advocate for what you need personally, just like you can advocate for what we need collectively. And those are the skills and the tools that I wanted to translate into the space around women's professional development in particular.
That is amazing and so powerful. And I love that your work is really dedicated to helping women step into their boss identity. And, I'm used to working in the entrepreneurial space, but you work with women across all career fields, I believe.
Yeah, I work with women typically who are feeling a little bit fed up with where they're at in their career. So they're oftentimes looking for that next level, looking for a new job, looking to make a career transition into a totally different field, or simply looking to gain more power and control over shaping their career in a way that supports their life. So maybe it's getting a raise, getting more flexibility, negotiating the terms of their career that will work for the kind of lifestyle that they want. So it's interesting. I work almost primarily with women who are not necessarily entrepreneurs. Maybe some of them have side hustles or are considering entrepreneurship down the road. But for me, I know that I couldn't even really start my own business until I had a strong financial foundation and had ascended to a point in my career where I felt like I could take on more risk.
What do you find are some of the most common things holding these women back when they're getting ready to consider these big transitions?
Yeah, so interesting. I see two really different kinds of women who come through my doors, whether it's at the Bossed Up Bootcamp weekend-long training program that I collaborated with you on, or through our online community, which has a ton of resources and a Facebook group called the Bossed Up Courage Community. The two kinds of women I tend to see there are as follows. One, I am so burnt out. I am so frustrated. I'm so beleaguered. I can't go on like this anymore. Those are the women who, like me, found themselves feeling a little adrift, a little purposeless, or a lack of vision in their lives. They're like, I don't know what I want, but I can't do this any longer. And then the other kind of women I tend to see in our programs are the women who say, everything here is fine. For all intents and purposes, my career is going fine, but I feel like I'm called to do something more, and I want to take proactive steps to gain the tools and gain the skills to really accelerate my progress, not just wait for progress to find me, but to learn how to advocate assertively for what it is that I want. So whether you know what you want or feel like, all I know is that I don't want this, the Bossed Up community has turned into this really powerful space where women can start to see themselves as the boss of their own lives and careers.
So is that what you mean when you say boss identity?
Yeah. So one of the first chapters in my book, after I talk about the science of burnout and understanding the martyrdom mindset and learning to ditch that whole philosophy of sacrificing our well-being for the sake of our careers, I dive into this concept of how to create your own boss identity, which is interesting, right? Because identity politics is a big part of what I learned from my campaigns and elections work as well. We tend to behave according to our identified identities. So if I say I am a Democrat, or I am a feminist, or I am an outdoors person, like I love being outdoors, that identity can shape a lot of my behavior. It can actually predict a lot of my behavior, as it turns out. Campaigns are very interested in that science. But when I think about creating this boss identity, there's actually a really interesting body of research around the iterative process of seeing yourself as a leader. And it's a little counterintuitive because some days, you feel like you walk into the office with swagger. You're like, I got this. I'm going in to give a presentation. I know this stuff. And then other days you're like, this is not what I know. Like, why am I being asked to do financial analysis? This is not my strong suit. And you don't feel like a boss about certain domains in our life. As it turns out, you can actually design to develop your own boss identity. It's not just about having confidence or not. It's about taking strategic risks. Kind of like, let's say I'm an intern. I have no real authority. I have no power that's derived from the hierarchy that I'm in. But I think there's a problem with how we're doing data analytics. So I want to bring that up. I can make a boss move first by saying, hey, let's get together tomorrow at 4:00. I want to talk about the data analytics processes we have in place and a few questions I have about how we might improve them. So that's me taking the first step of developing my boss identity. Then other people can either blow off that meeting and think, who the hell are you for calling it? Or they can show up. And in showing up, it's this part of the identity creation process that's actually validated by the response you get from others. Because our identities are not shaped in isolation. We internalize the response we get from others. So once we make a boss move, we see how the world reacts to that boss move. We internalize a little risk tolerance assessment of whether or not we're ever going to do that again.
Wow.
And it's a really interesting cycle you can put yourself through over and over again to start to build up your own tolerance of risk by seeing yourself as someone who can make boss moves.
That is so powerful. And it sounds like you've really studied the science behind that. That's something that I've found to be so anecdotally true in my life. And one thing
Right?
that I always say about confidence is you can't think your way into having more confidence. It doesn't work that way. You have to prove it to yourself. And you prove it to yourself by doing something that at least a little bit scares you.
Yes. It's funny because whenever you're in this identity expansion mode, like for me, I remember being at my peak of burnout. I was very unhealthy. I hadn't stepped foot in a gym in about 3 years. And prior to that in college, I was a college athlete. But I no longer saw myself as an athlete. So in order for me to feel strong, to have this sense of identity that was, I am a strong person, or I am a runner, or I am an athlete, I had to start doing things that were a little outside of my comfort zone, right? I signed up for my first ever 5K race. And, that was something I'd never done before. It scared me a little bit. So by taking that first step, I could begin to see myself differently, especially when I crossed the finish line and saw all those people validating me and saying, yeah, this is a thing you can do. Hello, you just did this. You got this. And that 5K turned into a 6K, turned into a half marathon, turned into, in the culmination of my sort of fitness journey over 2 years, I competed in an Olympic triathlon.
Wow.
So, with these little bets you take on yourself, you can start to actually expand who you see yourself as. And for me, with that added physical strength came a whole boatload of mental strength that enabled me to take big risks like starting my business right around that same time.
And I love what you just described as a progression. It was one step outside of your comfort zone. You didn't just say, I haven't worked out in 3 years. I think I'm going to do an Olympic triathlon.
Right.
Because that just would have been not appropriate.
Not so
at
great.
that point, And I love what you just described. It was a progression of increasingly bigger risks. It was like, holy crap, I just did that. What if I did a little more? And then what if I did a little more after that?
Yeah, and I think that's how it always works, right? Like you can actually change the way you view yourself. And when you change your identity, you make yourself much more likely to take different actions from there on out. So if I start to see myself as someone who can speak up for myself because I did it once, even though it was scary, but people listened and I was validated by that external vote of confidence, I'm going to feel more capable of speaking out when I see injustice anywhere, or when I see something that I don't agree with. I'm going to give my opinion freely, because it turns into this snowball effect of risk-taking begets risk-taking. Being willing to see yourself differently gives yourself permission to act differently moving forward.
And it's kind of addictive in a way. You're like, wow, like I wonder what else is possible. I didn't know even that was possible. And then you build from there. Exactly. And I have to say, what you're saying now just resonates with me so much. And, one of the chapters in my book, and actually the first episode on this podcast, was about owning your style. And we talked about how the way that you dress and the way you present yourself is a form of communication. And it just goes to what you're saying, like this idea of like what identity are you presenting to the world? Because that's how they're going to relate to you.
Totally. And what's interesting is that we have to acknowledge that sometimes you're going to take risks and it's not going to be well received. I can imagine that.
That's what I wanted to ask you about next.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough question because there's this concept from a book I like called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. It was one of the books I read when I was starting my business. And they cover a lot of stuff that I found superfluous. But one of the things that Eric really hammered home was this concept of pivoting or persevering. And when you make a boss move and you get a negative response, for me, the question becomes, okay, how do I internalize or externalize that negative response? Should I pivot and approach this process differently? Like if nobody shows up for that meeting that I call, maybe I need to have more one-on-one meetings first to establish if other people see this as a problem. Or maybe sending one email wasn't enough. Maybe I need to swing by people's offices or get some more buy-in. And that's a pivot. You're pursuing the same goal, but you're pursuing it in a different tactic or with a different strategy. And then the other concept is the persevere concept. Maybe I should just say, you know what? These folks have a problem with me that has nothing to do with me. It has more to do with where they're at right now because the company's going bankrupt and announcing layoffs tomorrow. So maybe I can persevere down this path and basically externalize the negative feedback I'm getting as not having to do with me, but having more so to do with those other folks and what they're bringing to the perception table. Women run into this a lot, and women of color in particular, because the same thing that a white dude says in the office might get a round of applause, but when a woman or a person of color or a woman of color speaks out in the same way, we might get an eyebrow raise, like what's her problem or why is she being so aggressive? And sometimes we have to acknowledge that, you know what? I actually don't want to change my tactics. I think the world needs to change in terms of the bias that we're bringing to the way we perceive women and people of color in particular. So sometimes it's okay to externalize a negative response, kind of like when you get advice from a mentor. Some of it you want to take and work with it, and some of it you're like, you know what? That might have worked for you, but that's not going to work for me.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think we are ultimately social creatures, and we do relate to ourselves like somewhat in the context of how we relate with others. So I think that is the potential danger of like, it's amazing when the response we get from others reinforces this new identity that we're trying to build. But there are a lot of opportunities for some of us, especially the more marginalized, people that are taking risks, where sometimes the response is going to suck. And like, how do we then not internalize that? Right. And how do we know when to internalize and when to externalize?
Yeah. I mean, there's no good answer there. I wish I had it. I wish I had a better one, because it's really tough because we have to parse through the bias. Sometimes when you get feedback, some of it's basically coming from a place of insecurity or bias, or even unconscious implicit bias that they're not even meaning to give you. These are well-intentioned people. But the way I think about it is what we can control is who we are going to for advice. This is part of the last chapter in my book called How to Craft Your Own Community of Courage. We actually have some power in choosing who we go to for feedback. So I always give this example. I call this mirror theory. Like, what mirrors do you want to stand in front of to get the reflection you need when you need it? My husband, Brad, the boo, is the kind of mirror for me, in which he always reflects back to me the most fierce, confident person that I can be. He has total faith in me, has total belief in my abilities, even when I'm doubting myself. So he's a great person for me to go to when I'm feeling full of self-doubt. My wonderful analytical father, who was trained as a lawyer, on the other hand, he's really good to go to when I need someone to look at the plan I'm putting together and find all the potential holes in that plan.
Yes, absolutely.
Like all the potential problems. So he's not the guy to go to when I'm feeling very insecure, because he's going to feed into those insecurities. He's going to reflect back to me the fears of a loving parent who doesn't want their daughter to take risks and get hurt. So, being more mindful, I had to realize at some point in my mid-20s, I need to be really conscious about who I'm reaching out to and when, and know what I'm going to get. Because you can stand in front of funhouse mirrors over and over and again, hoping you'll see a different kind of reflection, but you're going to keep getting that warped response. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be proactive about seeking out the kind of feedback we need.
I think that is really the perfect solution, because there's so much we can learn from the feedback we get from people. And sometimes feedback makes us better, or sometimes they're just not into our
Right.
idea or what we're doing. And it's there's a quote from Dita Von Teese in my book where she said, you could be the ripest, juiciest peach in the world, but there's still going to be someone who doesn't like peaches. You're not going to be for everybody or every idea of yours. I have a very similar example in my book of a friend of mine who every time when I was starting my business, when I would say I was getting ready to take on a new studio, they would just be like, ooh, are you sure about that? Well, what about this? What about that? Have you thought about what if this happens? And it was just so disempowering. And really, I was looking for someone to just, be my enabler and just believe in my vision and be like, yes, totally go for it. And actually on one of my coaching calls, recently with the early readers for the book, one of the ladies in the group said that her coach told her, if you really want to do something, all it takes is one person to tell you to go for it. And and I do find that to be true. If you've really got a dream and you tune out the naysayers, you can always, find the courage to go forward as long as somebody else believes in it. And I think you're right. You can't win over every person in the world. There's no election that ever happens unanimously. You just have to find your people and figure out, like you said, that sometimes it's appropriate to get the critiques and the, the devil's advocate. Sometimes you really need that.
Right. and that's why I like calling it your community of courage, because you're not looking for yes women only. You're not looking for pure enablers, because we all need people who are going to help us be courageous, but not blindly running into risk. You know what I mean? So I feel like we can all pay more attention to how we feel around our loved ones and friends and network, and do more to be around people who make us feel courageous. Because to me, that's the adjective that best sums up what enables women to make big leaps in their career, is courage.
Hey, it's Andrea here. Thank you so much for listening. I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that my book, Own It All, is now available to be ordered at Amazon. And go get your copy. And by the way, my 8-week Own It All challenge starts soon. You can get more information and sign up for that at AndreaIsabelLucas.com/challenge. Now, you mentioned something about the science of burnout, and I'm very interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah. So burnout is very casually used and thrown around as kind of a term that is synonymous with exhaustion. But in reality, burnout is a clinically diagnosable mental health disorder. According to the World Health Organization, it's characterized by a lack of agency, feeling like you're not in the driver's seat of your life, persistent and chronic stress in the form of exhaustion. That's not just a bad day or a bad week, but we're talking bad months with no end in sight. And feelings of ineffectiveness and a lack of accomplishment. So even when you are getting shit done, there's no longer that dopamine hit in your brain that gives you a little mental, gold star sticker. You don't feel any forward movement or any progression in your life. And so when we really look at the science of burnout, we got to clarify, how do people get there? And there are interesting systemic factors at play, because we definitely don't see in the media and in our society writ large women encouraged to play the leading character of their own life. We're often historically been the sidekick character or the woman waiting for Prince Charming. And fortunately, that's changing because our media is improving. But, your identity, like we go back to your boss identity, it's not created in isolation. It's influenced by the world around us. So when I think about burnout, certain people experience more burnout than others. I'm thinking specifically about women and people of color who experience more microaggressions every day. Those little comments or snide remarks or seemingly innocuous actions that are really slight degradations on your humanity. And so when you look at burnout, the science of burnout, and then overlay that with intersectional feminism, there's a real problem in this country around empowering women to be the boss of their own lives. And how you approach it when you're in the midst of burnout is it has to be a clinical response, So in my book, I walk through understanding how you can identify your burnout triggers and how to put your oxygen mask on first, not only so you can help others, but because women deserve some fucking oxygen too.
Right. Imagine that.
I know. What a radical notion, right? Humanity. It's part of you're entitled to being seen as a human. So it's a complex chapter. I'm not going to lie. It's hard to sum up in a soundbite, but understanding that burnout is quite serious is the first step to treating it properly, because it can be a gateway into even more serious mental health disorders, including chronic anxiety, which impacts way more women than men, and of course, depression. And those are deadly diseases that we're talking about. So we need to treat them seriously and not just tweet about them and make burnout into this trendy BuzzFeed article catchphrase.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned the boss identity and really using your actions and the responses you get from others to improve your risk tolerance and ultimately level up your identity. Is the boss identity is it an alter ego or is it like your main identity?
That's so interesting. It's come up a few times with some of my early readers and some of our community members, especially as it comes to work-life balance. We are always juggling multiple identities. So I identify as a really ambitious woman, a business owner, but also someone who likes to leave my phone in the car and go camping in the Rocky Mountains for a weekend. And so sometimes our identities compete, but I don't like to fall into this alter ego philosophy because it actually detaches you from your achievements. And I really want women to internalize that boss identity, to see that as myself. I've had some women at Bossed Up Bootcamp say, this is like my Sasha Fierce identity, like Beyonce has. And I'm like, no, this is you, boo. Like, this is you. You did this. You negotiated that raise. You leveled up in your career. Be proud of yourself. And I'm on my podcast every single Tuesday, we end each episode with a caller who calls into the show to brag on her bad self for a second, to share her boss move of the week. Because I really think it's important that we make it okay for women to own, just like you're talking about, to own their successes as much as we own up to our struggles. So it's, I think having this alter ego feeds into this false philosophy that it's not you, it's just your mama bear coming out.
Right. That makes total sense. And so one of the things I assume that you work on in your Bossed Up boot camps and with your clients is mindset and helping women to build their confidence.
Totally. And confidence is a funny thing, right? Because some people have this misconception that it's a fixed trait. You're either born with confidence or not. And having a fixed trait mindset, which was identified in the 1960s by a researcher named Carol Dweck and her incredible team, having that fixed trait mindset can lead to really self-defeating behaviors. For instance, if you feel like, I am just not the kind of person who can speak out on my own behalf, it's just not who I am. I'm soft-spoken. I identify as these traits are fixed and immutable. They cannot change.
Right.
Whereas if you approach it with a growth mindset, I might say, yeah, I know that I haven't really worked out in 3 years and I don't really see myself as an athlete right now. But that is not a fixed quality or characteristic about who I am. I'm going to approach this new challenge of the 5K that I signed up for with a growth mindset, which says to me, everything is figure outable, right? You can learn as you go. Everybody can learn and improve. And it sees effort and struggle as a very positive thing. So when I'm struggling through my 3-mile run on a Saturday, that struggle means I'm growing, I'm learning. Whereas when you have a fixed trait mindset, let's say you're struggling your way through a math exam in 7th grade, the part of your voice in your head might be saying, you suck at math. You're never going to be good at this. And that's a fixed trait mindset that can really hold you back from trying new things, from learning through growing, and through seeing effort and input of energy as part of the growth process, not some referendum on your incapability.
So it sounds like what you're saying is just realizing that humans evolve, we can learn new things, right. We can foster certain traits in ourselves rather than just saying like, oh, I'm an introvert, or like, right. I'm not good at math, or like whatever those things are. I'm not very athletic. It's really just the difference between thinking those are changeable or thinking that they're fixed.
Exactly. And you write about this in your book around Why Not You? You touch upon the fact that Vera Wang didn't really start considering a career as a wedding gown designer until she was 40 because she had failed at figure skating competitively. And Julia Child didn't get into French cuisine until her late 30s, right? The stories out there, especially about women who are successful, we need to acknowledge that everybody can learn and grow, and that failure is not the end of your career. It might be the beginning of a new career. Because when you approach all of this with a growth mindset, you can, even at any age, right, acknowledge that I am capable of learning and growth through effort. And it makes you not shy away from challenge as like a risk of being seen as incapable. Some people will say, oh my God, I'm in my 40s. I can't start hiking now, or I can't start biking now. I'm too old for this. And that's the fixed trait mindset talking. When we really, if we can be a little more compassionate, have a little more faith in our abilities to grow and learn, it's easier said than done because oftentimes we inherit our mindset from our parents or our loved ones. But the book that Carol Dweck wrote about this, called Mindset, is a really great place to start.
And do you have any tips or strategies that you use when you are just starting out at something and it kind of sucks? Like, how do you persevere and try to be consistent in the face of like, oh God, I tried this new thing and actually it's not going very well.
Right. Yeah, I write about a story in my book about how 3 months into starting my business partner and I basically went through what I call a business lady divorce. We dissociated. Okay. It became very clear after our first ever Bossed Up Bootcamp that she had a different vision for the company, and I was not willing to compromise on mine for the first time ever. And so that was a very demoralizing failure because at that time it looked like it would have been easier to just quit than to persevere. So one thing I always say is this is a good time to fall back on your courage community and really surround yourself with people who are going to give it to you straight, but also inspire courage in you. And the other thing is to come up with a better voice in your head. I struggled with having a fixed trait mindset my whole life. I was a perfectionist who was taught to perform, perfect, and please. And for someone who really thrived in academia, like I prided myself on being a straight A student, or at least mostly A's, I should say, but being a really, diligent performer academically, failure was this like getting an F in life, in any arena, in any pursuit felt like such a referendum on, oh my God, aren't I a smart person? Like I thought I would be capable of doing this. Maybe I'm not. So I had to really come up with new lines to feed the voice in my head. I'll give you an example. Recently, I made a huge mistake, which I've never made before or since, which is time zone related. Ever since I moved out to Colorado from the East Coast, I've really realized that time zones are an area for growth for me, despite as easy as Google Calendar tries to make it. And I blew off a call with a very important client because I was in the middle of recording a podcast and thought the call was 2 hours later, since there's a 2-hour time difference between East Coast and Mountain Time. So that was such a mistake. My whole body, when I realized I'd missed like 7 calls from this very important client, and they were like, "Where are you? We're waiting for you. We've got everybody on the line here." My whole body just flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone. And have you ever had that feeling, Andrea, of like your face is getting flushed because you just really messed up and there's no...
I've had like my hands go numb.
Yeah.
Like my hands and feet go numb. It's like the worst feeling ever.
Yeah. And you're like, there's no fudging this. There's no like tiptoeing back to it. Like I blew it. Like I really messed up. And so the voice in my head was saying, "Oh my God, you're such a fuck up, right? You so messed this up. You're so like, you should know better." And it was really beating me up. And I said, "You know what? I'm not perfect." And everybody makes mistakes. And once I had that line for the rest of the day, I called the client. I apologized profusely. I found a way to make it up to them and we rescheduled and everything was fine. But I had to really write out the words that were coming out of my head that were not helpful. Like, "You messed up big time. You're such a screw up." That's not very helpful. But once I reframed it as everybody makes mistakes, even you, nobody's perfect, then every time throughout the rest of the day and week, because this hits you in those waves, you're like, "God, I can't believe I did that," And that body-wide feeling of shame and guilt and, "Oh my God, I screwed this up so bad." I had my lines ready. I literally would say it out loud to myself, "Nobody's perfect, not even you." And honestly, sometimes just writing out the voice in your head and then giving it some better lines that have a growth mindset approach can be really helpful in persevering through the failures that are inevitable on the road to success.
That's huge. And I'm just picturing like this shame monster just rearing its ugly head, like at, the most inopportune moments. But I love the idea of being prepared for that, like kind of planning for it and just being prepared with a better response.
Right. Exactly. You got to feed it some better lines sometimes. It is a body-wide experience when you're feeling shame, and it sucks. You have to like regain control over the voice inside your own head.
Which is, to me, most easily done when you're saying things out loud. Like it's so hard to change that internal landscape without bringing anybody else in on it. And that is one thing I do talk about in my book, is just the idea that like changing the channel on those negative thoughts and like flipping to like a more positive station is like a good place to start. But then like once you find that new statement, like saying it out loud in some way, shape, or form to others, because then they echo it back and reinforce it. And then it feels a lot more true than just like reciting an affirmation to yourself.
Yeah, and sort of figuring out what works best for you. At Bossed Up Bootcamp, I always have some exercises that are done out loud with others. And I also have some exercises which are guided reflections like you have throughout your book, really asking women to journal, to meditate, to dive deep within themselves. And what I find is that some people lean very heavily in one direction versus the other. And I always say, that's some data about yourself that you can lean into. It's not to say that you shouldn't ever try the out loud version if you're more of a writer and a reflector in the written form. But it means, if journaling is the way that you process, lean into that, use that as a mechanism through which you can work through this stuff just as much as like a daily journal.
Yeah, that's great. I know both are super important to me. I do have to journal daily. I start to feel not sorted out if I don't.
What's
the
funny?
Only way I know how to explain it.
If I look back at my journals, they're all during really crappy times in my life.
Okay.
Because my journals, I really use my journaling when I'm struggling with something, when I need to sort something out, like you said, and when I'm really needing to parse through mixed feelings I have. And so what's amazing is that as my career and life have become more aligned with my core values, I find that I journal way less and I write publicly way more. So
wow.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've almost completely abandoned my journaling, and I've journaled pretty consistently since the 3rd grade. But now I consider my blog part of my journal. I just feel like there's less to hide and there's still plenty to write, but I like processing things with this community that is Bossed Up.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Really, this is the first time I've thought about that interplay between the conversations that you have with yourself and the conversations that you have with others in your network of conversations. Like they each have their place, and it sounds like the places they have are a little different for different people.
Right.
Like for you, it's kind of like a refuge of like sorting out your mixed feelings on something before you're ready to kind of go public, where
Totally.
for me it's like a catch-all for everything. It's just like a way to like see what even is in there, and then if anything looks like it needs my attention, then I go from there.
Yeah, I like that.
But yeah, that's really neat to kind of consider both those internal conversations that you have with yourself, as well as those external conversations are going to have different, impact on different people.
Totally.
Which makes sense, right? Because we all have different degrees of introversion, extroversion.
Mm-hmm. And get what you need, Like I try not to do things that aren't serving me anymore. I find I used to feel a little bit of guilt for kind of abandoning my journals, but now that I recognize what I was getting out of them, there's no need for me to keep doing anything just because I was doing it. I try really hard to just remain true to my, like, what's fueling me, not feeling like I'm doing things out of habit or obligation alone.
That makes a lot of sense. I actually, I'm kind of mentally tying that into a conversation that I was having last week on the podcast about the idea of having a stop doing list. How there's just things that you just don't have to keep doing. Some of them you're like, I hate this. I hate every time I have to do this, and I want to stop doing that. I want to delegate it, whatever. But then there's things where it's like, wait, do we really still need to do that? Like I was doing every quarter, I was like dumping all of my spending transactions into a spreadsheet, sorting it and tallying up what I was spending in each category. But like I wasn't really doing that much with the information after I did that. And it's about the same every quarter. So I've just like decided it was really time consuming, and I don't feel like I need to do that anymore. Like,
yeah, I call that philosophy in my book, quit some shit. Because it's super simple. It's like, God, we keep doing things out of obligation, out of habit or mindlessness. And women are overwhelmed, overburdened. We have a lot of goals we're pursuing. And I always encourage women to identify what they can quit, or what, like you said, the drop it list. I love that concept. And it makes you better at everything else you really want to do.
Yeah, we only have so much time and bandwidth.
Exactly.
All right. So on that note, I know you probably only have so much time to chat today and have lots of other things that you're working on. So I will let you go, but I want to take one more minute to let our listeners know how they can keep in touch with you and how they can get a hold of your book when that launches.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Andrea, for having me on. And for anyone who wants to keep in touch, they can head to bossedup.org and join our free online courage community there. And that's where you'll also keep in the know about Bossed Up, a grown woman's guide to getting your shit together, which hits shelves on May 21st. And I'm also on Instagram and Twitter and all the places at Emilie Aries. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so, so much for joining. Thank you so much, everybody out there who's been listening to the Own It All podcast. As you might know, I started this podcast with the intention of just doing 8 episodes to coincide with the 8 chapters of my book, Own It All, which is now available on Amazon. I was going to do this just for a limited time to help build excitement around the launch of my book. And what was going to be 8 episodes has turned into 9. So we got a little bonus episode in there, which was a fantastic one. And I have actually decided that I love doing this podcast and I'd like to continue doing it. So I am going to take a little break and reset and get ready to come back with more episodes. So if you have not yet, please do subscribe in your favorite listening app. If you haven't had a chance to rate the podcast, please do. Tell your friends, and I will be back soon with more episodes of Own It All.